Hello and welcome to Tales from the Hut and Hangar. My name's Keith Brooks. I'm currently in my car driving to meet up with Rick Lee. We both live in Weston-super-Mare. It's a nice sunny day, 9th of August, and we're going to start doing our podcast stroke webcast, depends what you want to call them, because a lot of people that we mix with and that have good tales to tell, and we want to record some of this stuff after talking about it for many years. I met Rick about 5 years ago with our involvement with Middlezoy Aerodrome. I look after the website and social media side of it, and also the Somerset Aerofest, which we just had our third show just gone, which went really well, apart from the weather was a bit iffy on both days, and luckily Navy Wings decided to go ahead with the display and it went down really well, so that's successful. So we plan to do more of these web podcasts in the future. This one will probably go into about 3 or 4 knowing Rick, because he's a great storyteller and really interesting to listen to. So today we're going to basically record just a summary of his career in aviation and various stories until we stop, and then we'll probably go back and record using video, photographs, and showing you around the Middlezoy, especially where we're based. So I shouldn't be long till I'm there, and we'll move on to the interview in a minute, and I'll speak to you at the end. Thanks very much. Hello.
Hi Keith.
Hello Rick. Now this is Tales from the Hut and Hangar, and with Mr. Rick Lee. He's kindly just made me a nice cup of tea and we just had some donuts. I've done an intro, which is it's okay, but that's fine. We'll get straight into it. Can you give us your full name, please?
My full name is Richard Frederick Lee.
Frederick.
That's 4 letters of Frederick spelled Rick, and that's why I've become to be known as Rick Lee.
Was that your dad's name, Frederick?
No, it wasn't all my granddad's name.
Oh, right, they just made it up.
It was made up. King, leader of men, Richard Frederick.
And your date of birth, please, sir?
2444.
44, blimey, that's a long time ago.
It is. It's during the war. I had a tin hat on when I came out.
And where were you born?
I was born in Withington, which is in Manchester.
Oh, right, Manchester. Okay.
Yeah.
Whereabouts in Manchester? North, south? Withington?
Looking at the map, bit to the left and down the left-hand bottom corner.
Oh, okay.
That's all I can sort of think of.
All right, so we're here because of aviation. What's your first aviation memory that you could? Why did you end up in aviation? Where did you get hooked?
I got hooked because my father was in the Air Force. He wasn't a pilot, but
Like mine as well.
yeah, we travelled a lot, India and the Middle East, and it was during these postings when I was 3 in India in 47 and in Iraq in 53, I actually flew in aeroplanes, transport aeroplanes. I saw jets flying, the first few jets in Iraq, and they interest me. So that was my first aviation.
So what was your first flight then?
My first flight would have been in a Dakota in 1947 when they took out the families from the 1947 Indian partition, the riots, and we had to leave quickly. And I remember my mum and sister. My sister was 2 years older than me. I was about 3.5. She was 5, something like that. And my mother and sister were crying, and my dad was behind us, pushing us onto a DC-3 to get us out of the country. And I just remember getting in this aeroplane for the first time. So that's the first aeroplane I remember.
Did you got the front with the pilot?
No, I didn't. We were sitting on the floor in the back with other Europeans and RAF families that were being taken out of the riot area, I seem to remember. All I remember really, and it wasn't a particularly nice flight, was people being sick and sitting on the floor of a DC-3. So
God.
it wasn't a very good memory. my very first memory. But
So that was an Air Force one, yeah?
it was an Air Force, could have been American, but yeah, it was a DC-3.
It's probably still going.
Probably. Yes.
Buffalo Airways, I expect.
And other flights that I remember, which again was from Habana, and we were kicked out of Habana in 1953 when I was 9. Saddam Hussein had just come to power with the Ba'athist Party and killed the king. And anyway, there were riots going along around the lovely base in Habana. And we again had to leave quite quickly in a Hastings across the desert, Jordan, and we were flying towards North Egypt, Idris, which is a big RAF base then and was through the war. And that had been, that was again an exciting flight. The engines stopped slowly. First one over the Jordanian desert, got a bit quieter in the noisy thing. And then the second one started backfiring and we landed on 2 in Idris, and taxiing in, another one stopped, and I think they took us off the aeroplane on the taxiway. And it had been the water had been the fuel had been contaminated with water, so they found out. So that could have been a disaster. So not many good memories as a very small boy.
All right, it didn't put you off then.
No, it didn't put me off. Yeah.
I was just reading about the Hastings and that big cargo pod underneath it. I didn't realise they had those. They used some on Constellations as well. Great big sort of pannier that's stuck underneath it. And used to put all kinds of stuff in it.
That's right. I actually, while I was waiting to do my jet hunter course many years later at the age of 19, the course was delayed by 2 months. And they came into the crew room and they told 5 of us on the course, 4 of us, that we had to go away for 2 months. We couldn't have leave. And I picked a Hastings squadron or Hastings base at Cologne, just above Bath. And I actually flew as a co-pilot on Hastings for 2 months, waiting for my hunter course.
Well, I never.
Which was fun. And we went to Germany with some American, what do they call those? Presidents and men, or in the, yes, in the American Congress. What were they?
Oh, right.
Senators. Sorry,
Senators, yeah.
So we went around America with about 15 senators round Germany, and they were visiting all the American bases. And I wasn't part of the real crew. We had a signaller in the back and an engineer.
I thought you said singer.
And what?
A singer in the back.
Singer, yeah. And they just told jokes continuously. I don't think I've ever enjoyed myself more in an aeroplane with a crew. And I never was a crewman because I was always single seat after that. But my only job was, because I hadn't done the co-pilot's course, was to hold the stick back as this guy with a moustache with rows of medals, and he did the Berlin airlift. I said, and I had to keep the stick back in my tummy with him so that the engineer could throttle back. It wasn't an easy aeroplane to land the Hastings.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, so I did fly in them, and they brought back a few funny memories.
Right then, Rick, let's move on to the endless aircraft that you've flown, in whatever order you like, but people will be interested to know how big, how small, how fast, gliders, balloons, whatever.
Okay.
Over to you.
Thank you.
Memory test.
Thank you, Keith. Well, apart from those early ones in the military, following my parents around the world, I got interested in aircraft to fly myself when I was an ATC cadet. And my father was a storeman in charge of all the jet spares at RAF Stafford 1632 MU in the Midlands. There was no airfield there, and it was the usual young child making aeroplanes and looking at Eagle comics and getting interested in things that fly. And the first things I did were throw gliders. I never went into little engines. And then my father was a King Scout, and he wanted me to be a little bit more adventurous, I think, and took me along to the local scout hut, boys brigade, and a few other things. And I didn't find it particularly absorbing. But then I heard about the Air Training Corps when I was 13. And I went along to the Air Training Corps, and straight away I knew that This was for me. There was a bit of marching and visiting airfields, and I flew in a Vulcan, in the back seat of a Vulcan.
Wow.
That little dicky seat, that was amazing. I watched things like javelins start up and have centerline closure and blow up. That was fun. And then eventually I got old enough to go and fly gliders, and I went to Cosford and to their gliding school. My instructor was a chap called Flying Officer Trump, which I thought was rather lovely.
Donald.
Yeah, this is not the same as the guy in America now, thank goodness. It wasn't related. Anyway, I flew with him in a Sedberg, a side-by-side, a big glider.
All right.
And then I went on to the Mark III, the little ones, and I did my first solo, sort of in a few hours, and then I went on to fly Austers, excuse me, and Tiger Moths. So I got my flying scholarship with the Air Training Corps. I went to Skegness and flew Oster aircraft, the J1N, and we did our aerobatics and spinning in a Tiger Moth.
All right.
My instructor was a Second World War Danish fighter pilot, flew Spitfires. He was blind as a bat and never saw the Germans once in the war, but he was a nice guy. Anyway, after that, I decided I wanted to join the Air Force, and I took my O-levels at the age of 16 and a bit. And we were living in Wolverhampton then, and decided that I didn't want to stay at school and flick inkwells and bits around the room. So I went and applied to the Air Force when I was 17 and a half. And I got in on a direct entry, and I signed up for 20 years. I got an extra $2 a week, I think, for signing up for 20 years and not 12. And then, went into training. And
Did you actually stay in for 20 years in the end, or?
I did the 20 years. And I would have stayed longer, but that comes later. Anyway, so I got into flying the jet Provost, and I flew at Church Fenton and did my 11-month course there in the winter of 1962. And if you remember that,
the year I was born, I can't remember.
Oh, right. It was
the winter, yeah, the
really,
winter.
really cold.
Yeah,
it was.
Right.
People were
63
really
as well, and winter 62, 63.
The polar bears were cracking into Leeds, I think. And
we got a photograph of me. My mum holding me on the River Thames when it froze over in 1962, 63. I was only a few months old.
Goodness me.
It's a picture I look at now. It's incredible to think how cold it was.
Oh, gee, it was terrible. And anyway, I remember they had this vampire-engined truck going along the runway, blowing all the ice off the runway.
Brilliant, yeah.
And they had this 6-foot-high wall of ice along the secondary runway.
Crikey.
And it was really quite exciting. But we managed to finish the course, and I went on to Vampires. One of the last courses at Swinderby, 166 course. The Vampire had been flying for many years then as a trainer. The Gnat was just starting up, but I was sort of near to the bottom of the guys that passed out, so I wasn't the guy that was going to go on to Gnats, which was really good. I think my flying was fine, but OQs probably. I was associated with an ex-sergeant who flew javelins.
All right.
And living in a caravan next to the airfield. I still talk to him. He's in his mid-80s now. We're good friends. An Australian. Anyway, so I left there and I went on to Vampires, and I flew those at Swinderby, and that was a fabulous course. During the course of the basic flying training, we started with 30 and 15 were chopped, because that was the chop rate.
Right.
And a lot of my friends, which I didn't think should have been chopped, were chopped. They had to cut the numbers down. The Vampires, nobody got chopped. We were told by the guy, a chap called Walker, Wing Commander Walker, that the only people that left Swinderby on the course were those that either killed themselves or they volunteered. And we all sort of looked at one another and thought, this is magic. So, and we all passed.
Oh, right,
we all went up. And I got one of 4 postings out of about 20 to go on to Hunters. So to speed it up, I went from Jet Provost Vampires onto Hunters. I flew Hunters, and then my life went basically Lightnings, 3 tours on Lightnings, different marks. I didn't fly in Germany, but I did, but only as a visiting pilot. and we flew in NATO, intercepting Russians and all that stuff. And then I went on to training people on the Hunter at initially Chivener, and Chivener was closed down. And then I went to Brawdy with 234 Squadron, which was an OCU with 63 and 234, and 79, which did older men and different courses. And we went to Brawdy, and I flew the Hunter for 2.5 years. That was really good to be back on the Hunter. I never.
Is that one of your favourites? Is it?
Very much so. It still is. I didn't mention that I flew my first Hunter squadron in the Far East on 20 Squadron, and then my second squadron was Lightning's 74 in the Far East. So my first 6 years of operations, one was in Borneo during confrontation, and the second tour was Lightning's, which was just buzzing around the island of Singapore and annoying people. And we also flew to Darwin and did some exercises with the Australians, which was good because I eventually became an Australian and flew with them. So after the Hunters, I was asked if I wanted to go on to Harriers or Jaguars, and that Jaguar was coming in, and I went on to the Jaguar. I didn't fancy going up and down in the woods near Russia.
Leave that to Dave.
Yes, I got a friend who flew them, and they're fantastic airplanes, and I did a lot of combat against them, and eventually flew in a Sea Harrier. It really was a fabulous airplane, and I would love to have done a tour, but there you go. I probably wouldn't have survived. So I went on to Jaguars, and I did my Jaguar tour at Coltershall, where I'd also flown Lightnings, and that was in 75, 74, 75 for 2 years. And then I went to Oman. Somebody in Oman said, who knew me in Lightning, said they needed a weapons officer, and I'd done the Jaguar weapons instruction course, and I went to Oman and flew Jaguars. Lots of fun there, and not so much fun, but that comes later. I had to jump out of a Jag, but that'll come in as some other briefing.
We'll cover some
we'll
of this.
Cover that.
A lot of this stuff.
And then I came back to England for 6 months until my 20 years were up. A little bit more than that, about 10 months. And I went to Boscombe Down, where I flew, my goodness me, I flew as a co-pilot in a, what's that thing that goes over the sea with 4 engines? A Nimrod, that was right.
All right.
A Hercules. One of the guys on A Squadron who hadn't flown the Lightnings, Jaguars and Hunters he was on B Squadron, used to stick me in the back seat of these other fighters that I'd flown, and he'd sit in the front and get his. So I kept up with flying in quite a few.
So quite interesting then, really.
It was very good. So there was 6 months there doing pilot's notes and weapons manuals. So that was my first.
What's that, writing them or?
Yeah, sort of looking at them and changing them. And
procedural stuff.
While I was there, the Hawk, which I flew, I had to. The boss there, the wing commander, said, "Rick, I want you to write up the pilot's notes on the Hawk and check that and do all that." And I said, "Well, I haven't flown it." He said, "Oh." I said, "I'm not going to do it, sir, if you don't let me fly it," sort of tongue-in-cheek. And he said, "Go on then." So I went off and flew the Hawk for 50 hours, which was good.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it. So those are the jets that I flew in the Air Force. And then I left and went to Australia to join my parents who had emigrated in 1968. And I'd gone out there to see them when I was in Singapore. And I knew lots of Australian pilots who were now air marshals and all sorts of people, higher rank. And I met them again when they'd been flying Sabres and Mirages while I was flying Lightnings and Hunters. And I asked them if they needed a fighter pilot who was 38 years old and didn't want to drive a desk. And they said yes. So I joined the Australian Air Force and flew the Mirage. But before that, they taught me to speak Strine, and they sent me to a training place called Sale, where I learned all the ways to, and they were slightly different, the techniques on the air traffic control and things like that. And I flew the Mackie and a little thing called a CT4, which is a 2-seater side-by-side, low wing, bumbling aeroplane. And then I went back and did the Mirage course, or up to Williamtown. And I flew Mirages for 4 years flying all around Australia, doing various air-to-ground, air-to-air, fired missiles, sidewinders, and the Matra Magic. So a lot of weaponeering. And then I went from Australia after 4 years back to flying in an Air Force again, the Royal Air Force, because it was more like sitting on the beach in Australia. Having had 20 odd years in NATO, I felt a little bit, what's the word, underworked.
Yeah.
And I could see that the F-18 that was coming in wasn't going to come in soon enough. So anyway, I resigned from the Australian Air Force and went back to England and flew with Fradu. And I flew Hunters again for another 5 years, which was great. And after that, I then went into a different sort of mode. I was getting to the age where leaving the Air Force and going to the airlines, which 85% of people were doing, I decided to go ballooning. So I became a commercial balloon pilot in 1989. I bought a little balloon, and I could tell that 1991, 92, I left Fradu. And of course, the Russians left. What was it called? It became
Perestroika, isn't it?
Perestroika, yeah. And Russia stopped, so the Cold War stopped, and there wasn't any threat. And I didn't particularly want to fly airliners, and I became a balloon pilot. And in a year, I got over 100 hours in my little balloon. On one day, I did 10 hours in my balloon, and I got my commercial license, passed the exams, and then started flying hot air balloons for various companies in England on the south coast and the Midlands.
All right.
And then went to Australia. While I was in Australia flying hot air balloons, I became a bush pilot. I got a commercial license on Cessnas, 206s, 210s, and flew people around the centre of Australia to Ayers Rock.
Okay. Any really remote bush flying?
Yeah,
small
going
strips
out
and
to
medical
strips.
things?
I didn't fly medical, but I got lost a lot of times out bush. I got basic GPS, but and I got stuck one night in the dark and landed and got into trouble because I wasn't night qualified, but nobody on board but me. I was frightened myself. And then I was flying balloons in the morning, Cessnas after I'd refuel my balloon, do a couple of hours to Ayers Rock and back again. And I did that for about 3 or 4 years. And then I started my own balloon business, and I ended up, another story, flying a £100,000 balloon over the central Australia, not far from Ayers Rock. Had to close that down. It became financially unable to continue, to get people to help me. And I then became a barnstormer flying tiger moths around central Australia and down in South Australia. I met a guy called Captain Biggles, and I became Captain Boggles, and Biggles and Boggles, and I travelled around the countryside finding farmers' strips, and you can imagine what a farm would be like in Australia. And we'd then put up a sign and clear about 300 meters of bush and fly people in a tiger moth. I enjoyed that. And we ended up in Robe in South Australia. And I've flown gliders again in Alice Springs. So the types, quite a lot. And I've had 2 of airplanes of my own. One I've still got, which is a Tailwind, made by a chap called Steve Whitman. And I flew those friends, and I also flew the Mk.26 Spitfire for 10 years on and off. And I got back into the Hunter, and a guy bought 20 of them for $50,000 in a sale in Singapore.
Amazing, isn't it?
And I started flying Hunters again at the age of 64, and I flew them from 1963 in my first flight in a Hunter until 2010.
It's incredible, isn't it?
So
Your connection there.
Yeah, I've been very, very lucky. a guy phoned me up and he said, "Are you Rick Lee? Have you flown Hunters?" And I said, "Yes." "What do you think of them?" I said, "Great." He said, "Well, I got 20 of them." And he'd bought them, and he was just a truck driver, but that was wonderful. And I think probably one of the most memorable days were the two airplanes, which I really loved. I mean, the Lightning was just mind-blowing, but the Hunter, I was test flying the Spitfire Mk.26 in a field in central Brisbane area, just inland from Brisbane, about 50 miles away in the bush. And I had to fly the Hunter at an Air Force base about 50 miles away. The only way I could get there was to take the Spitfire Mk.26 out of this bush strip, land at the Australian airfield, fly the Hunter, and then fly back in the Spitfire. So that was a day that I will always remember as
an interesting day. Yeah,
one of the best flights.
That was one of my questions coming up actually. So
yeah, that sort of saves me going on about that for a bit, doesn't
it? Go on as long as you want.
There are many types I've flown, which I'd have to look at my logbook. Light aircraft. I wasn't a qualified test pilot, and I've never said I was. I went for the course, or went for the interview and the exams when I was flying Hunters. My boss put me in for it, and when they put the questions to me, the exam, the only thing I got right was my name at the top. All the questions are about maths, and some I got right, but I hadn't done advanced maths. Okay. And I tried to teach myself over 6 months how to do not algebra, what's the other one, the difficult one?
All right.
Yeah,
So yeah, no, don't talk about maths.
So I didn't get in. He said, "Rick, you're a good frontline pilot, stay on the squadron," which I think is great.
So going back to my list, that I've got a few questions here. What was the most interesting best flight? The one you mentioned that day. What was a day that really stood out flying wise?
It was definitely a Lightning flight, and this sounds a bit bullshitty, but anyway, it was a trip in a Lightning, and it was in Singapore in 1968, Hangar 68, 69, and we had a visit from the RB-57. Which was an American high-flying Canberra with these massive engines on.
Oh yeah.
Very modified, and they had spaceman gear on.
Still going, aren't they? I think.
Yeah, they still are. They went over some of the flights from Elon Musk recently.
But it's incredible, isn't it? That thing's still going.
And it was there ostensibly they reckon, to take samples of cumulonimbus, but I think they were spying in Vietnam and various people.
Oh, I see. That was shielding.
And across in
shielding the truth of what it was doing, really.
But anyway, they were there, and they were keen to show us how high it could go, and we thought that would be lovely. So they took off and climbed almost vertically at 193 knots and climbed up to around about 85,000 feet, and a couple of us, I think, had to try and intercept them, and it was quite a difficult sortie, but it was the first time that I got up. I saw 77,000 feet on the altimeter, and it was still winding up slightly, and I was so concerned about the distance I was from the RB-57, because they told us specifically not to fly past them supersonic or at high speed. But the aeroplane literally just, the Lightning fell out of the sky round about 77, 78, 79,000 feet, and it was just, there was no elevator control. You had aileron control. The reheats had gone out on the way up at about 68,000. And I was on a locked attack, and I was 120 miles behind it, accelerating from Mach 1.3 to Mach 2, and then doing a gradual climb at 525 knots to try and get within 8 or 10 miles of this very, very high flying aeroplane, somewhere near 85 to 100,000. We weren't told, but he was above 85. And so I managed to get the missile indications to go off, and then I just sort of floated up past it on the left, probably about a mile or so. and then the nose of the Lightning just dropped. I was in coal power then. I'd cancelled the burners, which had gone out anyway. And the sky was very, very dark up there, as you've all seen in these spacepack films. And there was curvature of the Earth, and you just felt completely out of place. You knew you shouldn't have been up there, really.
Yeah.
We
didn't belong there.
We were in an oxygen system which, if it had gone, I had 8 seconds and maybe about a minute of pressure breathing, which I practiced in England. So if anything had gone wrong with the canopy or the pressurization, I probably wouldn't be saying this today. Anyway, went down, and it just, with the throttles fully back, from about 78,000 feet somewhere, the nose dropped. It went back up to about Mach 1.8, I think, at idle, just going down vertically. And it was only when I got to about 38,000 feet, still doing about 1.4, the air started to get thicker, so you could then recover. So that was probably the most unusual, memorable flight.
Yeah, amazing.
But not best flight. It was more tense.
Yeah.
But something that I was only going to do one.
Well, that's right. That's a rarity. Not many people have done that, have they, really?
No, they haven't. I mean, a lot of my friends that you'll read about, Dave Room has gone up and reckon he went higher, but the Lightning could do it. But it was on the edge, if you like, and there wasn't a great deal of control.
So what's the fastest you've actually flown then? What have you think?
I've seen Mach 2 in 2 different aeroplanes. Excuse me. Just to get it out of your system, you couldn't go for Mach 2 in this country. I've been at Mach 1.8, I think, coming back from Scotland after intercepting a Russian, and we had a race with a Phantom in the 1970s, and we thought balls to the wall, and we sat out over the North Sea, a friend of mine, and said, let's see who can go the fastest. And we went backwards and forwards up to about just under Mach 2, going down the North Sea. But I think we annoyed a lot of people in gas things, or what they're doing, the oil rigs and things. Right. And I'm always waiting for the phone call for that one. But getting to Mach 2 is a very difficult thing to do unless you've got a tanker to go to, because you cover a tremendous amount of space, 20 miles a minute. You're using fuel, 50 gallons a second, sort of thing. Literally.
It's an amazing amount.
And you have to be going towards your base. We're not taught, SR 72s and 71s and all this sort of stuff. You can, but you need tankers. And there's not a lot you can do at Mach 2, really. But it's nice to do it. And so to get it out of your system, usually your second trip on a squadron, which was mine in the Lightning in the Far East. The first trip was the second day, go out and do your Mach 2, get it out of your system, because we couldn't do it in the UK. It was difficult to do it out over the North Sea when you were training to learn to fly the Lightning. And it's just a number on the gauge, really. But you've got to be going towards base. So you go out subsonic, turn around, point towards base, hopefully it's not over a town, and then you just leave the throttles in the top left-hand corner and watch this thing creep up. God. And it's not, 20 miles a minute, it's 20 miles a minute, but, it's something you tick the box with.
But I suppose you get the more feeling for speed the lower you are and stuff. That's more.
Sorry, I missed that.
The feeling for speed, I suppose, if you do low level.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
That's more fun. A bit like driving a Mini on the road. It's like a rocket on the road, isn't it? On certain
unbelievably, the lower
tracks.
You get. I mean, you're looking at. As I remember seeing a film from a tornado. It was before it was called a tornado. It was Mother Riley's cardboard aeroplane at that stage in the game, and MRCA, and we were on a course somewhere, and weapons effect course, and this guy comes in. I knew him well because I went through South Cerney with him. Burroughs, his name was, and he was in charge of bringing the tornado into the testing. And it was a room full of fighter pilots. A lot of us had done high speed, low level, and all sorts of people from NATO. And he came onto the stage and he said, gentlemen, this is what you'll be flying in the next 20 years or next year or so, but it'll be around for 20 years. And he started a film, and it was this aeroplane that he'd been testing, and it was off the coast of Scotland. And it was like a lot of high-speed films at low level. It wasn't, something out of the best film in the world, but it was going, and you think, my God, he's fast. And he ran this for about 30 seconds, and we were all going, Jesus. And he was just over the waves. And we all thought, you've got it on high speed. You got it on your high speed, turn it up. He said, no, this is 800 knots on the deck. and that was the tornado.
Amazing.
Now, you couldn't do that safely in the lightning. A lot of people tried to go very fast. They throttled back and it got surging. So you had to be very careful when you were using an aeroplane at low level. Anything below 5,000 feet, where you've got turbulence and very thick air, the engines, you have to be extremely careful with how you use your engines. Otherwise they'll surge.
Yeah.
And the pressure, if you pull it back too quickly, like a couple of guys did and killed themselves, they blew the aeroplane up and didn't get away with it, right? Or lost their aeroplane. It would just send the blades forward because the air is not supposed to be going through.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So the faster you go, and I did a speed trial for when they sold the Lightnings to Saudi Arabia. They did trials in other countries, but they asked our squadron in the Far East, because it was very humid, 2 pilots, me and a chap called Dave, go out over the sea out off Malaya there, at the Malacca Straits, and we had little temperature gauges stuck to us around our body, which we could read, so we could look down over our May West and take little readings. And we had to fly just above the waves. I think it was 100 feet, 150 feet, 200 feet, 450, 550, 650. And when we got up to almost supersonic on the deck, we had to read out the temperatures on our body, so that when the Arabs bought them, they were going to be hot, and whether or not the temperatures on the human being.
Yeah.
And we had air suits underneath our flying suit,
okay,
with air going through them. It was they're quite normal. You can get them, cold air. And anyway, we did this, and I can't remember throttling back this particular engine, but the engine started throttling back all by itself. It was my number 2 engine, the engine on top. But I'm looking down, doing 600 knots, trying to take these readings and miss the sea, while my mate's over there doing the same thing. And all of a sudden I looked across, I could see my throttle moving by itself. The number 2 throttle came back about 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch.
Mistrons.
Yeah, and I look across at the gauge, and I thought, and the gauge was coming down as well.
Oh.
And I immediately thought, this is obviously weird, right? Fortunately, I was only about 40 miles away from base.
Oh, okay.
And I climbed very slowly. It didn't touch it at all. The temperature at that stage was normal on the engine, but I thought, my goodness. And the throttle, I didn't touch it, which was the best thing I could have done, for about 4 or 5 minutes. And I joined the circuit. The temperature was going up slowly on the JPT, but the throttle and the RPM was just wobbling a little bit. As I turned base, the whole engine seized. It caught fire. I didn't know it was burning, but the engine literally blew itself up. It looked like a carrot that you chewed all the things off, right? I went to the engine bay about the next morning, and they took the lid off the top of the Lightning and the lid off the engine, and all the blades were bright blue. They'd all just gone.
Blimey.
So just flying along and being gentle,
cool.
Somewhere along in that surging, one blade had gone. It cleaned the whole lot out.
Cool.
So yes, you can't go too fast at low level.
No.
Unless it's planned to do it.
Yeah, which is what tornadoes are designed for.
Yes. So it's the intake system and the way the air gets in and out of the engine.
Oh, right,
Sorry,
okay.
anyway.
No, that's all right.
There.
So, I suppose
lots of aeroplanes.
Lots of aeroplanes. So the worst and luckiest flight. I mean.
Oh, worst and luckiest.
Which no doubt we'll cover.
Oh yeah.
In a further adventure, but
I think that one has to be the Jaguar ejection, where it was blown up and a bomb went off on my wing. The last bomb, fortunately, I'd already dropped 4, but the last bomb was a faulty bomb, and it put me in hospital for a few months, and I had a bit of burns, a lot of burns, 45%
hell of a lot,
burns anyway. And I managed to get out of that thanks to Sir James Martin after about 5 seconds in a cockpit that was tumbling. But leave that for later.
Yeah, definitely.
But I think, what was the question? What was the worst and the...
What was the worst and what was the luckiest flight? I suppose that was it, really, was it? Or
have you had a really bad... I was flying. No, I think the luckiest flight was flying Hunters with Fragile. When pushing over the cliffs at Portland Bill with Dave Linney, another one of your victims. I was pushing down. We were cleared to 50 feet, and it was a Thursday morning. I'd flown that day in a balloon in the morning, that flight. And, oh no, it wasn't that balloon flight, sorry. The Dave Lilly. I had another ejection in a Hunter, but this was a Hunter experience, which something went wrong with the hydraulics big time, and all the Hunters were grounded in Fraju because there was a fault with the hydraulic system of putting the nipples on the hydraulics to join them. And I just pushed down. I was pushing down to 50 feet, and I was pulling the stick back gently in this two-seater Hunter. I was by myself in the left-hand seat, obviously, and the stick wouldn't move. No, it was a single-seater, sorry. And I yanked it back with two hands. My number two, who was sitting on my wing, said I disappeared in just a huge spray, and he saw the Hunter climb vertically out of the spray in front of him about 200 yards away. And all I saw was the sea, and I was heaving back on the stick, which was obviously in the hydraulics had failed. And I was expecting to feel a bang. But the airplane then went up vertically with the hydraulic failure. And what had happened was, as I'd pushed the stick forward to go over the cliffs near Portland Bill, this hydraulic pipe that went into the elevator jack behind me at the top of the tailplane there had come loose. There was no indication because all the hydraulic fluid was pissing out of the system, which took some time before it showed. And the hydraulics to the tailplane just locked it in that downward position, which was going to make me hit the sea. Now at 450 knots, which I was doing with no hydraulics to the tailplane, they tried to simulate it, but it was impossible. You couldn't pull the stick back. For some reason that day, I had enough power in my arms to pull the stick back into my stomach. It was sheer luck. The chief pilot said, I don't know how anybody could have done that.
The Hunter likes you then, I expect, as well, as you like the Hunter.
So that was the luckiest.
Yeah. Okay then, so recapping this bit now. Your top three aircraft today. Starting from number 3. So you got 3 aircraft, you take on your desert island.
Desert island.
No runway, but you can sit there and look at them. Okay, you're allowed to fly them, but 3 of them.
So I can't take off? I've just
No. Okay, I'm just saying like desert island dis.
Oh yeah.
So you've got to name your 3 best aircraft. You could have 10, but I'll give you 3.
That I like flying. Give me 3. That I would like to fly, or I fly?
Yeah, like to fly. If I had loads of money and said, Rick, I'll buy you 3 aircraft, which 3 would you like?
Well, my wife is lovely, and she's flown in the Spitfire and the Hunter. I'd like a Spitfire Mk.26.
Okay.
With the big engine.
Right.
The 2-seater. I want the 8-cylinder engine that goes in it in America. Mike, so that was the one that I tested. I flew it of somebody's 8, and it was just magic. So it's a sport plane. You can go around and think you're flying a multi-million-dollar Spitfire. You can't. So I'd like one of them. Yeah. So the next one to just look at and sit in. I'd like a Hunter.
Yeah, a Hunter.
If somebody said
you can fly all these, I'll let you fly all these.
I think I'd like a Hawker Hunter, a single-seater.
Yeah.
The 2-seater, it's a bit. Anyway, Hawker
so the
Hunter,
Spitfire take the wife out in. The Hunter to sort of
to
go shopping.
Yeah.
And then to your
but the Hunter has got to have, better hydraulics than the ones I flew.
Yeah, that's right.
It's got to have a fuel tank that never empties.
So a nice sunny day like today, and you feel like a hooligan.
Okay. Yes. What do I want? I want a pitch special.
Oh, okay.
I've flown them. I've flown a lot of biplanes, little biplanes and bigger biplanes. I flew an amazing one in America. It was quite a rare one. Somebody let me fly. So, but I think I'd like a pit special. And again, my wife says that she'd like to see me in a pit special, but she wants to be in it as well. So it would have to be the 2-seater.
There you go. Very nice.
So pit special, 2-seater,
Hunter.
S2, a Hawker Hunter, solo.
Yeah.
I want the big engine one, the ones I flew privately in Singapore, in Australia, not the ones. And what was the other one? Oh yes, Spitfire Mk.26.
Yeah, great, good.
Aerobatics.
You can cover it all.
Beauty. I mean, you can look at a Hunter forever.
Yeah, yeah. What's the most robust aircraft you've flown in? Like you said about just interested in like the bush planes, the Tiger Moths. Which one do you think is really well built, engineering wise, and is very safe? What do you think? Maybe the aircraft that last all these years, like the Tiger Moth and stuff. Is there something you thought that's been designed a bit like a Land Rover, or a bit like a really well designed thing?
I've had 3 crashes in the Mk.26, or 2 crashes in the Mk.26, and they survived. You can take the wings, so that was pretty strong. The Hunter, as you know, I've ejected from one, and I've been lucky in a few others. The strongest one. Let me think about that.
Okay, I'll let you think about that. Right, I think we'll call it the end now.
Yeah, okay, good.
You've covered a lot of stuff, which is really good. And we should definitely go back into a lot of that in more detail and film it and maybe do just a podcast, but there's a massive amount of subjects. So, thank you very much, Rick.
Thank you, Keith. It's been a pleasure.
Good. So anyone listening who has listened, if anyone has, if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, or just like it, or just listen to it, you can go via the Middlezoy one, Aerodrome one, or the one I've set up for this particular podcast. There will be links and everything else, but just any feedback, any criticism, anything, just please leave a note to see if it's worth us doing it, which we think it is. And then look forward to the next episode, which will be Rick.
What, again?
Well, we're going to do about 10 of them.
Oh, no.
Anyway, thank you very much from me and Rick.
Yeah.
See ya.
Cheers,
Bye.
folks.
Bye.